Tonight we wade through the fog to find what was hidden in plain sight. The development stories that never made it to credits, the Easter eggs that took decades to confirm, the technical tricks that turned PlayStation limitations into atmosphere, and the small, strange decisions that built a town we keep returning to. These aren't the big plot beats or the famous monsters. These are the details in the margins, the ones that make Silent Hill feel like a place that existed before the games and will keep existing after you put the controller down, so settle in. And as always, if you enjoy this content, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are listening from. The town that almost wasn't. Before Silent Hill had a name, it had a problem. Konami's Team Silent wasn't supposed to make a horror game at all. They were considered the B team, the developers who hadn't proven themselves on major projects yet. When the company tasked them with creating something to compete with Capcom's Resident Evil, most of the studio's top talent was assigned elsewhere. What remained was a small group working in a cramped office, given modest resources and low expectations. The pressure was minimal because nobody really believed they'd deliver anything groundbreaking. Keiichiro Toyama, who would become the first game's director, has spoken openly about this dynamic. The team's lack of prestige became their greatest asset. With minimal oversight and limited budget, they couldn't chase the cinematic, action-heavy approach that defined late 90s survival horror. They had to find another way. The decision to emphasize psychological dread over explicit violence, to use fog and darkness as much for technical necessity as atmosphere, to build a protagonist who wasn't a trained soldier, all of these choices emerged from constraint, not confidence. The name Silent Hill itself came late in development. Early builds referred to the location simply as the town. Several alternatives were considered and rejected. The team wanted something that felt American, but also carried an undertone of wrongness. A name that could belong to a real resort community, but also hint at what lay beneath. Silent Hill worked because it was generic enough to feel plausible and specific enough to feel deliberate. The double meaning, a hill that's quiet, a place where silence itself becomes oppressive, wasn't accidental. Team Silent was meticulous about these small linguistic choices, even when they didn't have the budget for elaborate cutscenes. What makes the name even more interesting is that there's no actual prominent hill in the town's geography. The streets are relatively flat, built around the lake. The hill exists more as a psychological concept, a place where you're always climbing or descending even when the terrain doesn't suggest it. This subtle wrongness in the name itself sets the tone for everything that follows. One of the most consequential technical limitations they face was the PlayStation's draw distance. The console simply couldn't render detailed environments very far into the distance without severe slowdown. Most games of the era solved this with careful camera placement or by keeping players in tight corridors. Team Silent chose fog. The thick, pervasive mist that defined Silent Hill's aesthetic was originally a practical solution to a hardware problem. But instead of treating it as a compromise, they leaned into it, building the entire atmosphere around restricted sight lines and ambient sound. The fog became the game's signature because the team understood that what you can't see is often more frightening than what you can. The technical implementation of the fog was more complex than simply adding a fog layer over the scene. The team developed a dynamic fog system that would thicken and thin based on proximity to certain triggers, creating pockets of visibility that pulled players forward through the environment. This wasn't just atmospheric, it was a sophisticated navigation tool that guided players without obvious waypoints or objective markers. The fog told you where to go by suggesting where you could actually see. The same principle applied to the game's monster designs. Masahiro Ito, the creature designer, worked under strict polygon budgets. He couldn't create the detailed, grotesque enemies that Resident Evil showcased. Instead, he focused on silhouette and suggestion. The nurses' twitching movements, the way the lying figures contort inside their own skin, the unsettling proportions of the mandarins. These were partly born from technical necessity, but Ito transformed limitation into artistry. He's discussed in interviews how he avoided orthodox demon designs, instead drawing from Francis Bacon's paintings and his own anxieties. The result was a visual language that felt more psychologically loaded than simply monstrous. Ito has revealed in recent years that many of his monster designs were created in isolation, without full knowledge of the game's story context. He was given general themes: hospital, medical trauma, bodily horror, and asked to create creatures that evoked those feelings. Only later were these designs integrated into the narrative framework. This backward approach, starting with feeling and then finding meaning, is part of why Silent Hill's monsters feel so primal and unsettling. They weren't designed to represent specific concepts. They were designed to make you uncomfortable, and the symbolic meaning was discovered afterward. Behind these creative decisions was a team dynamic that doesn't get discussed enough. Team Silent wasn't a cohesive unit from the start. Many of the developers hadn't worked together before. Akira Yamaoka, who would become synonymous with the series' sound, was originally a composer relegated to lesser projects. The decision to give him control over Silent Hill's entire audio landscape, not just music but ambient sound design, the radio mechanic, the deliberate use of silence, was almost an afterthought. Yamaoka has said that he didn't even want the assignment initially. He was more interested in rock and electronic music than horror soundscapes. But once he had the freedom to experiment, he built something that redefined how horror games use audio. The radio static mechanic is a perfect example of the team's willingness to break conventions. Most games telegraph enemy positions through visual cues or scripted events. Yamaoka suggested a diegetic warning system, an actual object in the game world that the player carries and hears. The radio doesn't just tell you something is near, it forces you to listen, to pay attention to the quality and intensity of the static, to understand the space around you through sound. It's a simple idea that became foundational to the series, and it emerged from a composer being given unusual control over gameplay feedback. What's particularly interesting about the radio is that its implementation changed during development. Early prototypes had the radio emit different tones for different enemy types: a high-pitched whine for aerial enemies, a lower rumble for ground-based threats. This was deemed too specific, too much like a radar system. The team decided that pure static, varying only in intensity, created more ambiguity and forced players to rely on visual confirmation. This made encounters more tense because the radio told you something was near, but not what or exactly where. What often surprises people is how much of the first game's story was retrofitted after the core mechanics were locked in. The cult, Alessa's trauma, the otherworld as a manifestation of psychic power, these weren't the starting points. The team built the town, the fog, the monsters, and the feel of exploration first. The narrative framework came later, constructed to justify what they'd already created. This isn't a criticism. It's why the first game's story feels so embedded in its environment. The town existed before the plot, and you can feel that in how naturally the two fit together. This development philosophy would become a recurring tension throughout the series. Later entries sometimes tried to start with story and build mechanics around it, which is part of why the Western developed games often felt disconnected from the original's atmosphere. Team Silent's approach was always about creating a space first and letting narrative emerge from exploration of that space. They built a town that felt real enough to be haunted. The budget constraints led to some creative solutions that became series staples. The lack of resources for extensive motion capture meant that many character animations were created through rotoscoping and manual keyframing, giving them a slightly stilted, uncanny quality. This wasn't intentional at first, but when the team saw how the imperfect animation made characters feel more dreamlike and dissociated, they embraced it. By Silent Hill 2, the awkward movements were a deliberate artistic choice. The first game's multiple endings were also born from constraint. Creating several different ending sequences was a way to add replay value without building entirely new gameplay sections. The team developed a point system that tracked player behavior, examining specific items, keeping certain characters alive, completing optional objectives, and used this data to determine which ending played. This system was never explained to players, creating an air of mystery around how the game made its determinations. Players felt like the town was judging them, watching their choices, when really it was just a sophisticated branching system hidden beneath the surface. The creature comforts what the monsters hide. The monsters in Silent Hill are often discussed in terms of symbolism and psychological projection, but there's a deeper layer of craft in how they were designed, implemented, and hidden across the series. Masahiro Ito has become more forthcoming in recent years about the decisions behind specific creatures, and some of his revelations challenge long-held fan interpretations. The most famous example is Pyramid Head. For years, players and critics analyzed the creature as a manifestation of James's guilt and need for punishment in Silent Hill 2. This is accurate, but Ito has clarified that the visual design had a more mundane origin. The triangular helmet was initially conceived as a more practical executioner's mask based on historical research into punishment rituals. The red, rust-stained metal was meant to evoke old blood and institutional violence. The sexual undertones in Pyramid Head's encounters weren't planned from the start. They emerged during development as the team recognized how the creature's actions could reinforce James's specific trauma. Ito has expressed frustration that later games recycled Pyramid Head without understanding that he was designed for James's psychological state specifically, not as a general Silent Hill icon. The creation of Pyramid Head involved extensive research into historical torture and execution methods. Ito studied medieval punishment devices, drawings from the Inquisition, and documentation of prison executions in early American history. The great knife that Pyramid Head drags wasn't just meant to be impractical and heavy. It was based on actual execution swords used in Germany and France, scaled up to inhuman proportions. The way the blade scrapes along the ground, the sound it makes, the effort visible in Pyramid Head's posture, all of this was carefully considered to create a sense of inexorable, methodical violence. The Bubblehead nurses from Silent Hill 2 have a similar layered history. Their design is often attributed solely to James's memories of his wife's hospitalization, but Ito has explained that the nurses also draw from his own childhood fears of medical settings. The way the head covering suggests a face without revealing one, the twitching movements that imply awareness behind the mask, these were personal anxieties made physical. The sexy nurse costume underneath the horror elements was a deliberate choice to create cognitive dissonance, forcing players to grapple with attractiveness and revulsion simultaneously. This wasn't accidental provocation, it was a calculated attempt to make players uncomfortable on multiple levels. What's particularly interesting is how the nurses' behavior was refined through play testing. Early versions had them patrol in perfectly straight lines with predictable patterns. Testers found them easy to avoid and not particularly threatening. The team added random pauses, sudden direction changes, and moments where nurses would stand perfectly still for extended periods before suddenly lunging. These behavior quirks made the nurses feel more unsettling and unpredictable, even though they were still following programmed routines. What's less known is how many creature designs were cut or modified during development. Early concept art for Silent Hill 3 shows several enemies that never made it into the final game. One was a hunched figure covered entirely in hair, designed to invoke body horror around femininity and aging. Another was a childlike creature with an adult face, meant to pervert innocence in a way that ultimately felt too on the nose. These cuts happened late in development, which is why you can still find texture files and polygon data for unused enemies in the game's code. Dedicated fans have extracted and reconstructed some of these models, giving us glimpses of what Team Silent decided was too much. One particularly disturbing cut enemy from Silent Hill 3 was called the Flesh Pillars in internal documents. These were meant to be vertical masses of human bodies fused together, standing in certain rooms like grotesque architectural elements. They wouldn't attack directly but would emit disturbing sounds, and their presence would drain Heather's health through a proximity effect. The team removed them because they made navigation too punishing, and because their design crossed into genuinely upsetting territory rather than uncomfortable horror. The monster spawning systems also hide small environmental storytelling tricks. In the original Silent Hill, enemy placement isn't entirely random. Certain creatures appear more frequently near specific locations based on subtle narrative cues. Groaners cluster around residential streets because they're meant to evoke the idea of pets left behind. The puppet nurses in Alchemilla Hospital patrol in pairs more often on the floor where terminal patients were kept. These aren't mechanics the game explains. They're environmental details that reward observation. Sound design for the monsters is equally layered. Each creature has multiple audio signatures: approach sounds, idle sounds, attack sounds, and death sounds. But there are also contextual variations. A lying figure's wet, muffled breathing changes pitch slightly depending on the room's acoustics. The mannequins in Woodside Apartments have a barely audible whisper track that plays when they're idle in darkness, something most players never consciously hear, but which contributes to the unease of those hallways. Yamaoka's team layered these sounds so densely that the full audio experience requires headphones and careful attention. The whisper track for the mannequins is particularly interesting. It was created by recording actors speaking random words and phrases, then processing the audio to the point of near incomprehensibility. If you isolate and enhance the track, you can make out fragments. Can't see, it hurts, where am I? These weren't meant to be understood consciously, but they add to the sense that the mannequins are trapped, confused entities rather than simple monsters. There's also the matter of regional differences in monster appearances. The Gray Children in the North American release of Silent Hill were replaced with mumblers in PAL and Japanese versions due to content concerns around depicting childlike enemies. This wasn't just a visual swap. The mumblers have different movement patterns, attack animations, and spawn locations. Players who experienced both versions often report that the school section feels fundamentally different depending on which monster type you encounter, even though the level layout and puzzles remain identical. The decision to replace the Grey Children wasn't made lightly. Konami's European divisions expressed concern that the childlike enemies would create classification problems and potentially prevent the game from being released in certain territories. The mumblers were designed quickly, reusing skeletal rigs from other creatures but with distinctly different visual characteristics. The fact that this swap could be made relatively late in development speaks to how modular the enemy design system was. Some of the most interesting secrets emerge from the series' reuse of assets. Several monsters across different games share skeletal rigs and base animations, modified through texture work and model adjustments. The double-head dogs in Silent Hill 3 use a modified version of the animation system from Silent Hill 2's Lying Figures, which is why their movement has that same unsettling, unnatural quality. The screamers in Downpour inherit behavioral AI from the nurses in previous games, adjusted for outdoor environments. These aren't shortcuts. They're efficient reuse of proven systems that maintain the series' feel. Enemy AI behaviors also contain hidden complexity. The nurses in Silent Hill 2 have proximity awareness tied to light and sound. Standing still in darkness reduces their detection range significantly. Moving slowly decreases the distance at which they become aggressive. These systems aren't tutorialized. Players discover them through experimentation or never learn them at all, instead assuming the nurses are simply patrolling randomly. The game rewards careful observation without explicitly teaching it. The nurse's AI also includes a curiosity behavior that's easy to miss. If you make a noise running, attacking, knocking over an object, and then hide, the nurse will investigate the location of the sound. But if you then make another noise elsewhere, the nurse will sometimes stop and decide which sound to investigate, occasionally choosing to return to her patrol route instead. This creates emergent behavior that makes the nurses feel like they're thinking rather than simply reacting to programmed triggers. Finally, there are the creatures that were planned but never implemented. Development documents reference a puppet baby, enemy for Silent Hill 3, meant to appear in the hospital's maternity ward. This was scrapped during testing because playtesters found it too disturbing, and the team agreed it crossed a line. The concept art still exists, showing a grotesque infant form with adult teeth and puppet strings attached to its limbs. Sometimes the secrets are what the developers chose not to include. Another cut enemy was the Memory Eater for Silent Hill 4, described in design documents as a creature that would steal items from the player's inventory if it successfully attacked. This was removed because it created too much frustration in playtesting. Having resources unexpectedly disappear felt unfair rather than scary. The creature's model was partially completed and exists in the game files, a slug-like thing with a distended belly and multiple grasping arms. The buildings have bones, architectural secrets. The locations in Silent Hill feel grounded because they were built on research and real architectural reference. Midwich Elementary School's layout in the first game is based on actual American elementary school designs from the mid-20th century. The long, double-loaded corridors, the central courtyard, the administrative wing near the entrance, these aren't invented spaces. Team Silent studied school blueprints to understand how these buildings function before they twisted them into nightmare versions. The team specifically researched Pennsylvania and New England school architecture from the 1930s through 1960s, looking for buildings that would have been contemporary when Silent Hill was supposedly founded, but old enough to feel dated by the late 1990s. Midwich's design borrows from real institutions, including elements from schools in Massachusetts and upstate New York. The courtyard design, with its clock tower and medallion locks, was inspired by actual schools that used enclosed courtyards as protected play areas during harsh winters. What players often don't realize is how much the level design was constrained by the PlayStation's memory limitations. Each area had to fit within tight RAM budgets, which meant careful management of what was loaded at any given time. The doors that load new sections weren't just convenience, they were technical necessities that the designers turned into pacing tools. The brief pause as a new room loads became an opportunity to build anticipation, to let the radio static spike, to prepare players for what waits on the other side. The loading doors had to be carefully positioned to break the environment into chunks that fit in memory while still maintaining spatial coherence. This is why certain hallways feel longer than necessary. They're creating buffer space between two memory-intensive rooms. The developers became skilled at hiding these technical requirements behind environmental storytelling, placing the doors at naturally transitional points like stairwells, heavy security doors, or passages between wings. Alchemilla Hospital's layout went through several iterations. Early designs had the basement as a more extensive area with a morgue and additional patient wards. These were cut not for content reasons, but because the PlayStation couldn't handle the additional geometry and texture data. The final version of the basement is a small, focused space centered on the generator puzzle, which was the most important narrative beat the team wanted to preserve. Examining the game's file structure reveals placeholder room names that never materialized: Morgue 01, Basement Hall C, Patient Wing 03. Ghosts of a more expansive hospital that existed only in planning documents. The morgue sequence would have been particularly elaborate. Design documents describe a puzzle where Harry would need to identify specific bodies based on toe tags and medical records, creating a macabre matching game. The room would have featured multiple examination tables and refrigerated drawers that could be opened. The team built a partial version of this space before deciding it slowed pacing too much and was too graphically intensive for the hardware. The color-coded plate puzzle in the Nurses Center is actually a remnant of a more complex routing system that was simplified late in development. Originally, players would have needed to find 8 plates scattered throughout the hospital, with more elaborate clues for placement. Testing revealed this was too obtuse and slowed pacing in an already lengthy segment. The puzzle was reduced to 4 missing plates with the poem clue, but the 8-slot panel remained, which is why 4 plates are pre-placed. Some players notice this detail and wonder why certain slots come filled. The answer is developmental compromise. The original 8-plate puzzle required players to understand color symbolism and poetic meter in ways that proved too obscure for most testers. The poem would have been longer and more cryptic, with each line requiring interpretation rather than being relatively straightforward. Simplifying to 4 plates made the puzzle solvable while maintaining the core concept. Woodside and Blue Creek apartments in Silent Hill 2 were designed as a single, interconnected structure before being split into 2 buildings for technical reasons. The fire escape that connects them is a narrative solution to a memory management problem. By separating the complexes, the game could unload Woodside's data once you entered Blue Creek, freeing up resources for the new environment. The remake's seamless transition between buildings is only possible because modern hardware doesn't face the same constraints, but the original design turned limitation into environmental storytelling. 2 buildings that should feel separate but share too much architectural DNA. The apartment interiors were designed with careful attention to making each unit feel lived in and distinct. The team created a resident profile for each accessible apartment, determining the occupant's age, occupation, family status, and personality. These profiles influence decoration choices, furniture placement, and the types of items left behind. This level of detail wasn't strictly necessary for gameplay, but creates the sense that these were real homes before something happened to the people living there. Brookhaven Hospital in Silent Hill 2 contains one of the series' most elaborate spatial tricks. The rooftop encounter with Pyramid Head appears to take place on the same hospital whose interior you've been exploring, but the exterior model and the interior level geometry don't actually align. If you could clip through walls and view both simultaneously, you'd see that the roof is positioned incorrectly relative to the floors below it. This isn't a mistake, it's the other world asserting itself, the space bending in ways that feel wrong if you think about them too carefully. The developers knew most players wouldn't consciously notice the spatial impossibility, but they included it deliberately to create subliminal unease. The rooftop itself was originally meant to be part of a larger boss encounter. Early plans had Pyramid Head chase James around the roof, using the ventilation units and raised sections as obstacles and cover. This was scaled back to the simpler shove off the roof moment because the boss AI couldn't navigate the rooftop geometry reliably, and players found the extended chase more frustrating than frightening. The Historical Society's impossible staircase to Toluca Prison is the most overt version of this technique. The descent takes far longer than any building's foundation would allow. The stairs don't spiral. They descend in a straight line that would have punched through the lakeside hillside into open air if the geography were real. This is intentional non-Euclidean design, using the loading corridor between areas to create a psychological journey downward that mirrors James's descent into his own guilt. The remake makes this even more explicit, extending the stairwell and adding unsettling visual details that weren't possible on the PlayStation 2. The stairwell in the original version takes approximately 45 seconds to descend at normal walking speed. Based on the number of steps and their typical rise, James descends the equivalent of roughly 15 stories, which would put him far below the lake bed. The remake extends this to nearly 90 seconds, adding environmental storytelling elements like water seepage, structural damage, and graffiti that becomes increasingly disturbing as you descend. Lakeview Hotel's layout is another example of hidden architectural storytelling. The hotel's ground floor is laid out as a functioning hospitality space, lobby, restaurant, guest services. The second floor maintains this logic with conventional room numbering and service access. The third floor begins to break down. Rooms are numbered inconsistently. Some doors lead to crawl spaces, and the employee elevator's weight restriction suddenly matters. By the time the hotel transforms after the videotape, the layout has completely abandoned architectural coherence. Rooms that should share walls are separated by impossible distances. Corridors terminate in spaces that shouldn't exist, and the whole structure feels like it's folding in on itself. This isn't random. It's a carefully planned progression from functional space to psychological labyrinth. The hotel's design was influenced by actual resort hotels along the Great Lakes, particularly establishments from the early to mid-20th century that catered to wealthy tourists. The developers studied photographs and floor plans of hotels that had since closed or been demolished, capturing architectural details that would have been contemporary to Silent Hill's supposed golden age as a resort town. The lakeshore restaurant's large windows facing the water, the wood-paneled bar, the grand staircase in the lobby. These are all period-accurate elements that ground the space before it transforms. What's fascinating is how the level designers use repeated architectural elements to create a sense of place without copy-pasting entire sections. The apartments in South Vale share door frames, baseboard details, and bathroom tile patterns, but each unit is distinct in layout and decoration. This creates a neighborhood feel. You're exploring multiple homes, not the same room over and over. The designers built a small library of modular pieces that could be reconfigured, allowing them to create variety within strict asset budgets. The modular system was sophisticated enough that designers could assemble a new apartment layout in a few hours using pre-existing pieces. Each module, bathroom, kitchen, bedroom, living room, came in several variations with different furniture arrangements and decorative choices. The system also included damage states, so the same architectural elements could appear intact, weathered, or destroyed depending on which version of the town you were in. The placement of save points in buildings follows its own subtle logic. In Silent Hill 2, red squares represent pages from Mary's letter, a symbolic choice that ties the saving mechanic to James's journey. These squares appear in locations that would have personal significance, beside beds, near windows overlooking the lake, in front of mirrors. The game never explains this pattern, but it's there for players who look. Similarly, health items are placed in locations that make environmental sense. First aid kits in hospitals and clinics, drinks in break rooms, food in residential spaces. The world maintains internal consistency even in its gameplay abstractions. Some buildings contain rooms that serve no gameplay purpose but exist to sell the space as real. In Brookhaven Hospital's first floor, there's a small staff break room that contains no items or puzzles. It's just there, a lived-in space with coffee cups, posted notices, and a microwave. Players can walk in, look around, and leave. The inclusion of these empty rooms makes the building feel inhabited before it was abandoned, which makes the horror of its current state more effective. These non-essential spaces often contained the most personal touches. The break room has employee schedules with names, a birthday card signed by staff members, a magazine someone was reading. None of this affects gameplay, but it creates texture. The team believed that environments felt more real when they contained elements that served no purpose except to exist, mimicking how real spaces accumulate objects and details over time. The radio has a history, sound design secrets. Akira Yamaoka's work on Silent Hill's sound design is celebrated, but the specific techniques he developed are less understood. The radio static that warns of monster proximity isn't a single sound effect. It's a layered composition that changes based on enemy type, distance, and environment. Yamaoka recorded multiple variations of white noise, radio interference, and electronic hum, then created a dynamic mixing system that blends them in real time. This is why the radio feels alive. It's not playing pre-baked warning sounds, but responding to the game state with subtle shifts in tone and intensity. The bass static was created by recording actual radio interference at different frequencies, then processing these recordings to remove any recognizable voice or music fragments. Yamaoka layered these clean, static tracks, creating a composite that had texture and variation. The mixing system would emphasize different frequency ranges based on what was generating the warning, creating subtle distinctions that players learned to recognize subconsciously, even if they couldn't articulate the differences. The radio's introduction in the first game was almost botched during localization. In the original Japanese version, Harry's line when the radio first activates is more questioning and uncertain, emphasizing his confusion. The English localization team initially wrote more expository dialogue explaining the radio's warning function, treating players as less observant than the developers intended. This was corrected late in the process, and the final English line, "Huh? Radio? What's going on with that radio?" maintains the mystery. The team learned from this experience. Subsequent games trusted players to understand mechanics through experience rather than explanation. The localization struggle around this moment reveals a broader tension in bringing Japanese games to Western audiences. The Japanese development philosophy often favored allowing players to discover and understand mechanics organically, while Western publishing assumed players needed more explicit tutorials and explanations. Team Silent fought to maintain their approach, and the radio's subtle introduction set the tone for how later games would handle their mechanics. One of Yamaoka's most innovative decisions was the deliberate use of silence. In most horror games of the era, ambient music or sound effects filled every moment, maintaining constant tension. Yamaoka advocated for long stretches of pure environmental sound: footsteps, distant water, wind through broken windows, without any musical underscoring. This made the moments when music did appear vastly more effective. The shift from silence to soundtrack becomes a narrative tool, signaling transitions or important encounters without requiring visual cues. Yamaoka has described his philosophy as aggressive silence, treating the absence of sound as an active compositional choice rather than empty space. He would carefully orchestrate when sounds would drop out, creating moments where players became acutely aware of their own breathing, the controller creaking slightly in their hands, the ambient noise of their real-world environment. This intentional manipulation of the soundscape made players feel exposed and vulnerable. The series' music also contains hidden layers that most players never consciously parse. Promise, reprise. The main theme from Silent Hill 2 uses a delayed vocal track that sits slightly behind the instrumental. This creates a dreamy, dissociated quality, as if the voice is echoing from a memory rather than the present moment. The effect is subtle enough that listeners might not identify it, but it contributes to the song's emotional weight. Yamaoka has explained that he uses these micro delays throughout the soundtrack to create a sense of things being not quite right without being obvious about it. The vocal delay in Promise, Reprise ranges from 30 to 150 milliseconds depending on the phrase, creating a shifting, uncertain relationship between voice and music. This technique, combined with subtle pitch variations and reverb that changes throughout the track, makes the song feel like it's playing in a space that doesn't quite follow normal acoustic rules. Listeners may not understand why the song feels unsettling, but they feel it nonetheless. Environmental audio in the games contains scripted moments that trigger based on player behavior. In Silent Hill 2, if you stand still in certain rooms for extended periods, you'll hear sounds that don't play during normal traversal, distant voices, footsteps in adjacent rooms, things moving behind walls. These aren't random. They're designed to reward or unsettle players who take time to absorb the atmosphere. Some are tied to specific events. Stand near a certain window in Brookhaven Hospital, and you'll hear a sound like something being dragged across the floor above you, even though no enemy is there. It's environmental storytelling through audio, suggesting the building's history without showing it. These environmental triggers were carefully placed to create narrative moments that players might miss. In the Historical Society, standing near certain paintings causes faint whispers to begin. In the apartments, lingering in specific rooms trigger sounds that suggest domestic life, a dish breaking, a door closing, a brief snippet of conversation before falling silent again. These moments reward patient exploration while adding to the sense that the environment is haunted by more than just monsters. The series also uses infrasound frequencies below the range of conscious hearing to create physiological unease. Yamaoka and his team experimented with sub-bass tones that you feel more than hear, creating a physical sense of dread. These frequencies are mixed into the otherworld's ambient soundscape, making those sections feel oppressive on a visceral level. This technique is why some players report feeling nauseated or anxious in certain areas. The sound design is literally affecting their nervous system. Infrasound frequencies between 7 and 19 Hz can cause feelings of anxiety, disorientation, and even visual disturbances in some people. Yamaoka used these frequencies sparingly, incorporating them into the otherworld ambient tracks and certain boss encounters. The effect is subliminal. Players don't consciously hear these tones, but they feel their impact. Some players have reported feeling pressure in their chest or slight dizziness during intensive otherworld sequences, physical responses to frequencies they weren't aware they were experiencing. Voice acting direction in the series has been extensively discussed, particularly the deliberately stilted performances in Silent Hill 2. What's less known is that this was a specific artistic choice, not a budget limitation. The voice director instructed actors to deliver lines with slight pauses and emotional flatness to create a dreamlike, dissociated quality. The idea was that these characters are in such extreme psychological states that normal affect is breaking down. This was controversial and remains divisive, but it was intentional. The remake's more naturalistic voice acting represents a different philosophical approach. Neither is objectively correct, but they create distinctly different tonal experiences. The original voice director reportedly gave actors specific instructions to perform as if you're slightly medicated, or as if you're speaking through a pane of glass. Actors were asked to do multiple takes with different levels of affect, and the team consistently chose the flatter, more disconnected performances. This extended to physical direction as well. Actors were told their characters should move a half second slower than feels natural, creating subtle but pervasive wrongness in body language. Some of the most disturbing audio in the series comes from recordings that were processed to become unrecognizable. Yamaoka has mentioned recording everyday sounds, metal scraping, water flowing, paper tearing, and then pitch shifting, reversing, layering, and distorting them until they become something new. The music in some otherworld sections isn't composed in a traditional sense. It's found sound transformed into dissonant atmosphere. This approach means the audio has an organic quality, something that feels simultaneously familiar and alien. For Silent Hill 3, Yamaoka recorded sounds in an actual hospital with permission, capturing ventilation systems, elevator motors, patient room ambience, and medical equipment. These recordings were then heavily processed, but the core remains recognizable on some level, creating an uncanny valley effect where the sounds feel medical and institutional, but not quite right. This grounding in reality makes the audio more unsettling than purely synthetic soundscapes would be. The radio broadcast that plays in the Brookhaven Hospital elevator in Silent Hill 2, the bizarre game show snippet, has never been fully explained by the developers. It's a brief moment of normalized audio in a deeply abnormal space, which makes it profoundly unsettling. Some players have speculated it's a fragment of James's memories or a representation of his dissociation, but there's no official answer. This kind of unexplained detail is something Team Silent excelled at. Not everything needs to be solved or understood. The game show fragment features a host voice that's almost intelligible, audience reactions that sound slightly wrong, and music that's too bright and cheerful for the context. The effect is deeply jarring, a sudden intrusion of normal reality into a nightmare space. Some players have attempted to enhance and isolate the audio to determine what the host is saying, but the processing makes it impossible to clarify beyond fragments. Finally, there's the matter of regional audio differences. Some dialogue lines and ambient sounds were changed or re-recorded for different territories, not just for language but for cultural localization. Certain vocalizations by monsters were adjusted because they carried different connotations in different regions. The work that went into ensuring the games felt appropriately disturbing across cultures without being misunderstood or offensive is rarely acknowledged but was a significant part of the localization process. For instance, some of the nurses' vocalizations in the Japanese version had specific tonal qualities that Japanese players would recognize as suggestive of certain psychological states or social anxieties. These were adjusted for Western releases to create similar but culturally appropriate reactions. The lying figure's muffled sounds were processed differently across regions to avoid similarities to actual speech patterns that might be recognizable or seem intentionally linguistic. The script was in rewrites, writing, and localization. Silent Hill's scripts went through more revision than most players realize, and not all changes improved the games. The first Silent Hill story was substantially altered during localization from Japanese to English, with some plot points clarified, others obscured, and character relationships adjusted. The cult's theology is more explicitly detailed in the Japanese version, including references to specific rituals and historical context for the town's founding. The English version simplified this material, which created ambiguity that some players appreciated but others found frustrating. The cult's belief system in the original Japanese script included more direct references to Gnostic Christianity and indigenous American spirituality, creating a syncretic religion that felt grounded in research. The English localization removed many of these specific references, worried they might be offensive or too obscure for Western audiences. This had the unintended effect of making the cult feel more generic and less culturally rooted. The Good Plus ending in the first game was added late in development as a reward for completing the optional Kaufman side quest. This ending requires finding items in specific locations, solving environmental puzzles that aren't part of the main path, and ensuring Sybil survives the amusement park encounter. What many players don't know is that the Aglaophotis vial, the item that saves Sybil, was originally meant to be a mandatory pickup with no alternative. The team decided to make it optional to give players choice and consequence, which was relatively uncommon in late 90s survival horror. The decision to make Sybil's survival optional was controversial within the team. Some developers felt that killing a sympathetic character should have permanent consequences and that allowing players to save her undermined the horror. Others argued that giving players the tools to make things better, if they explored thoroughly enough, created more meaningful player agency. The compromise was to make the save option obscure enough that many players would miss it on first playthrough. Silent Hill 2's script famously prioritizes ambiguity and player interpretation, but early drafts were more explicit about James's actions. There was a version of the videotape scene that showed more, making James's guilt undeniable rather than implied. This was walked back during development because the team recognized that the horror was more effective if players had to confront it themselves rather than having it thrust upon them. The decision to keep the tape's contents largely off screen and let players fill in the details was a late-stage choice that fundamentally changed the game's emotional impact. Early storyboards for the videotape scene were more graphic and explicit, showing James's hands on the pillow and Mary's face as she realizes what's happening. The team filmed these sequences but ultimately replaced them with the shadowy, obscured version that appears in the final game. The more explicit version was deemed too confrontational and risked making players turn against James entirely, preventing them from engaging with his journey toward understanding what he did. The infamous In Water ending in Silent Hill 2 is tied to a point system that tracks James's behavior throughout the game, examining certain items, listening to the entire rooftop diary, picking up the knife, and so on. This system was never explained to players, creating years of speculation about the exact triggers. Some players stumbled into this ending accidentally and found it devastatingly appropriate. Others played multiple times without seeing it and felt they'd missed the real conclusion. The developers have confirmed the system exists but never released the full details, preferring to keep some mystery intact. The point system is more nuanced than players initially understood. It's not simply look at sad items equals in water ending. The system tracks patterns. Do you consistently examine items related to Mary? How long do you spend looking at them? Do you protect Maria or let her die? Do you heal yourself or stay at low health? The system attempts to measure James's psychological state through player behavior, creating an ending that reflects how you played, not just what you chose. Maria's dialogue contains subtle variations depending on how quickly you progress through certain sections. If you return to her too slowly in some areas, her lines change slightly. She becomes more impatient, more accusatory, more aware that James isn't prioritizing her. These changes are small enough that players might not notice consciously, but they build the sense that Maria is observing and judging James's choices. It's character development through branching dialogue that doesn't require explicit player choice prompts. Maria has approximately 30 variations in her dialogue throughout the game, most of which players will never hear because they only trigger under specific timing and behavior conditions. Some of these variations reveal more about her nature. Lines that suggest she knows she's not real, hints that she's aware of Mary, moments where she almost breaks character before recovering. These fragments reward multiple playthroughs and create a portrait of Maria as someone complex and tragic, rather than simply a temptation. Silent Hill 3's script suffered from a troubled translation process. The English localization was rushed, resulting in awkward phrasing and tonal inconsistencies that don't exist in the Japanese version. Heather's characterization shifts between sharp and sarcastic to oddly passive depending on the scene, a side effect of different translators working on different sections without full coordination. Fans have retranslated key scenes and found that Heather is more consistently assertive in the original script, which changes how players understand her arc. The localization issues extended to the game's more cryptic elements. The Book of Lost Memories excerpts, the poetry fragments, and the cult documents were translated by different people using different style guides. This created inconsistencies in terminology and tone that made the game's mythology harder to follow than intended. Some fans have created unified retranslation projects that smooth these inconsistencies, revealing a more coherent narrative underneath. The joke endings in the series, the UFO endings, the dog ending, are beloved by fans, but they were controversial internally. Some team members felt they undermined the horror atmosphere, while others argued they provided necessary relief and acknowledged the absurdity of some plot elements. These endings were often added very late in development and usually required specific, obscure items that most players would never find on their own. The fact that they've become part of Silent Hill's identity speaks to the community's embrace of the series' willingness to break its own mood. The dog ending in Silent Hill 2, where a dog is revealed to be controlling everything, was partly a response to fan theories that were becoming increasingly elaborate and absurd. The team wanted to playfully acknowledge that sometimes there's no deeper meaning. Sometimes the explanation is just ridiculous. The care that went into creating this joke ending, including a full animation sequence and a custom rendering engine, demonstrates how seriously the team took even their most unserious ideas. Cut dialogue and alternate scenes exist in the game files, accessible through debug modes or data extraction. Silent Hill 2 contains voice lines for scenes that were removed or restructured, including an extended conversation between James and Eddie in the prison that reveals more about Eddie's history. These lines are fully acted and mixed but never triggered in normal gameplay. Their existence shows how much content was created and then cut to improve pacing or focus. The cut Eddie dialogue reveals more about his background, his father's abuse, incidents at school, a girlfriend who left him. The conversation is surprisingly sympathetic and makes Eddie's breakdown more understandable. The team ultimately cut this material because they decided Eddie should remain more opaque, more clearly disturbed, without extensive backstory that might make players feel they understand him. The horror is more effective when Eddie remains somewhat inexplicable. Some of the most effective writing in the series comes from documents and memos rather than dialogue. The patient records in Brookhaven Hospital, the historical plaques in the museum, the diary fragments scattered through the games. These pieces of environmental storytelling flesh out the world without requiring cutscenes or exposition dumps. The team understood that player-discovered narrative beats differently than spoon-fed information, and they crafted these documents with the same care as main story scripts. Each memo was written to serve multiple purposes, providing necessary information while also establishing tone, character, and world building. A memo about hospital protocols reveals bureaucratic indifference to patient suffering. A diary entry ostensibly about daily routines suggests isolation and despair. The team treated every piece of found text as an opportunity for storytelling, even when the information could have been conveyed more efficiently through other means. Localization also affected puzzle solutions. Some riddles in the English versions of the games are more obscure than in the original Japanese because wordplay and cultural references didn't translate cleanly. The poem puzzle in Silent Hill 3's Shakespeare anthology, for example, is more intuitive if you're familiar with Japanese poetic structures. Western players often found it frustratingly obtuse, not realizing they were solving a puzzle that was never designed for them. The Shakespeare puzzle relies on understanding syllable counting and thematic connections that work differently in Japanese. The English localization attempted to preserve the puzzle while making it solvable, but this required changing the actual poetry, which then created new ambiguities. Some solutions that made perfect sense in Japanese became oblique in English, requiring players to approach the puzzle from unexpected angles. The cutting room, what was left behind. Every Silent Hill game contains content that was created but never finished, or was finished and then removed. These cuts range from minor enemy variants to entire locations, and examining them reveals alternate visions of what the games could have been. The most substantial cut content from the original Silent Hill was an entire section of the resort area. Early planning documents describe a casino building that would have appeared along the lakefront, complete with interior spaces and gambling-themed puzzles, This was removed early in development due to scope concerns, but the building's exterior model was partially completed and exists in unused asset files. Modders have extracted it, revealing a detailed facade that matches the series' aesthetic but leads nowhere. The casino would have featured slot machines that required specific tokens found throughout the resort, card table puzzles involving pattern recognition, and a backroom safe containing a key item. The space was designed but never fully implemented because the team realized the resort section was already lengthy and the casino didn't add enough narrative value to justify the development time and memory footprint. Silent Hill 2 had multiple cut locations. There was a planned school section that would have appeared after the hospital, featuring otherworld classrooms and a confrontation with a manifestation of James's fear of judgment. This was cut because the pacing after Brookhaven felt wrong. Players needed to move toward resolution rather than encounter another extensive interior location. Some of the classroom assets were repurposed for the HD collection's bonus content, but the full sequence is lost. The school would have included a gymnasium boss fight, classroom puzzles involving grade books and report cards, and audio logs revealing disturbing aspects of the school's history. Concept art shows otherworld classrooms with students' names carved into every surface and desks welded into impossible configurations. The boss would have been a teacher figure, distorted and accusatory, though the exact design was never finalized. The prison section in Silent Hill 2 was originally more extensive. Development materials reference additional cell blocks, a workshop area where prisoners made license plates, and a greenhouse where they grew vegetables. These spaces were designed and modeled but never fully implemented. The workshop, in particular, would have featured environmental storytelling about prisoner labor and institutional exploitation, themes that fit the prison's historical role but ultimately felt tangential to James's journey. The workshop was partially completed, with machinery models and assembly line elements created. Players would have needed to solve a puzzle involving operating printing equipment to create a fake ID badge, allowing access to restricted areas. The greenhouse puzzle involved growing specific plants in the correct order to create a key botanical hybrid. Both ideas were clever, but ultimately cut for pacing reasons. Silent Hill 3's Hilltop Center shopping mall had several cut stores and interior spaces. Early builds showed a record store that Heather could explore, with functioning listening stations and posters for in-universe bands. This was simplified to just the exterior signage in the final game. There was also a planned arcade within the mall, complete with playable mini-games, but this was deemed too tonally inconsistent with the horror atmosphere and removed before the game went gold. The record store contained extensive environmental storytelling, CDs by fictional bands with names that reference cult concepts, posters advertising concerts that never happened, and listening stations that would play distorted music when activated. The mini-games in the arcade were designed to be deliberately broken and unsettling versions of real arcade games, with AI that seemed to cheat and visuals that would glitch in disturbing ways. The amusement park in Silent Hill 3 was going to feature more operational rides. The Haunted Mansion is fully explorable in the final game, but documents reference a planned Ferris wheel sequence and a fun house with mirror mazes. These would have extended the park sequence significantly, but testing revealed that players were ready to move on from Lakeside by the time they finished the main attractions. The extra content was cut to respect pacing. The Ferris wheel sequence would have been a boss encounter, with Heather fighting while the ride moved, creating a dynamic arena that changed as the car ascended and descended. The funhouse mirrors were going to be a complex puzzle where Heather's reflection would move independently, showing her where to go or what to do. Both concepts were ambitious but proved too difficult to implement smoothly on the PlayStation 2's hardware. Silent Hill 4. The room had the most ambitious cut content. The original design included more world locations beyond the apartment, subway, forest, prison, and hospital. There were plans for a library section, a museum, and a cinema, all of which would have been trap locations that Walter had used for his ritual killings. These were cut because the team realized the game was already long and adding more locations would extend playtime without adding meaningful narrative development. The library would have featured puzzles involving the Dewey Decimal System, with books that contained hidden messages, and a librarian ghost who stalked the stacks. The museum would have been filled with exhibits that slowly revealed Walter's backstory, with artifacts that could be examined for clues. The cinema would have shown film reels that represented Walter's memories, with otherworld manifestations emerging from the screen. All three locations existed in design documentation and early conceptual models, but none progressed beyond preliminary implementation. The apartment in Silent Hill 4 contains objects that were meant to have gameplay functions, but were simplified or removed. Henry's computer was supposed to be interactive, allowing him to research the ritual murders and read news articles about the killings. This was cut because it felt too modern and broke immersion. The team wanted the apartment to feel isolated and disconnected from the wider world. Some of the news articles still exist in the game's text files, written but never displayed. The computer content included fake news websites, email correspondence between characters, and a chat room where Henry could have communicated with other people investigating the murders. This was removed partly because the internet felt too contemporary, and partly because it gave Henry too much agency and connection to the outside world. The isolation of the apartment is crucial to the game's atmosphere, and the interactive computer compromised that. Origins had several cut enemy types beyond those mentioned earlier. There was a creature based on Travis's suppressed memories of his mother that was deemed too similar to other maternal horror imagery in the series. There was also a planned boss encounter at the Artaud Theater that would have involved stage machinery and theatrical props, but this was replaced with the Caliban fight for structural reasons. The mother-based enemy was described in design documents as a figure that would appear nurturing from a distance, but reveal disturbing features as you approached, motherly gestures combined with predatory intent. The theater boss would have used curtains, trapdoors, and flying rigging to create a dynamic fight where the environment constantly changed. Both concepts were fully designed, but never moved to the modeling stage. Homecoming's development was particularly troubled, and significant content was cut. An entire location, a lighthouse that would have served as the cult's ceremonial space, was removed late in development. Models and textures exist for this area, and it was far enough along that level designers had placed enemies and items. The removal created a pacing gap that the final game never quite resolves, jumping from one set piece to the next without the breather that location would have provided. The lighthouse section would have been a quieter, more exploration-focused segment between two action-heavy areas. Players would have climbed the tower, encountering environmental puzzles and minimal enemy presence, before reaching the top for a revelation about the town's cult. The location was nearly complete when it was cut due to disk space limitations on the Xbox 360 version, which forced the team to trim content to maintain parity across platforms. Downpour had cut weather mechanics that would have been more dynamic. The concept was that Murphy's emotional state would affect the intensity of rain and fog, with heavier storms during high-stress sequences. This proved too technically demanding for the PlayStation 3's hardware and was simplified to scripted weather changes tied to specific story beats. The dynamic weather system was impressive in demos, responding to Murphy's health, sanity, a cut mechanic itself, and proximity to key story areas. The idea was that the town's weather would literally reflect Murphy's psychological state, with thunder crashing during moments of high stress and eerie calm during puzzle solving. The system worked, but caused too much performance instability, dropping frame rates significantly during weather transitions. Perhaps the most intriguing cuts are the alternate endings that were written, voice acted, and then removed. Silent Hill 2 had a planned ending where James encounters other people in Silent Hill, tourists and residents going about their business, oblivious to the nightmare he experienced, suggesting everything was his delusion. This was cut because it undermined the game's established reality and felt too much like it was all a dream cop-out. The other endings treat the town's supernatural nature as real, even if filtered through James's psychology, and this rejected ending didn't fit that framework. The cut ending would have shown James leaving the hotel, driving back through town, and encountering normal people everywhere, families at the park, couples at restaurants, workers at gas stations. The juxtaposition would have been jarring, raising questions about everything players had experienced. The team ultimately felt this ending was too nihilistic and would leave players feeling cheated, so it was replaced with the Maria ending, which serves a similar thematic purpose while respecting the reality of James's journey. Some cuts were for content reasons rather than technical or design concerns. An early scene in Silent Hill 3 showed Heather encountering a creature feeding on a corpse in graphic detail. This was filmed in the sense of being fully animated and rendered, but pulled because it crossed a line the team wasn't comfortable with. The scene exists in development builds accessed through debug modes, though it's not fully polished. The feeding scene was significantly more graphic than anything else in the final game, showing the creature's feeding process in detail and the results on the corpse. Playtesters responded so negatively to the scene that it was removed immediately after testing, with the team recognizing they had misjudged how far they could push explicit violence. Finally, there are the monsters that exist only as concept art, creatures that never made it past the drawing stage. Every game has these early sketches that were too similar to existing designs, too difficult to animate, or simply didn't fit the final aesthetic direction. Some of these designs are hauntingly effective, and fans occasionally wonder what the games would have been like if different creature selections had been made. One particularly striking cut design for Silent Hill 2 was a creature called the Grief Widow in concept documents, a tall, thin figure draped in black fabric that would appear in the cemetery and follow James at a distance without ever attacking. The creature was meant to embody pure sorrow, and its presence would gradually drain James's health, forcing him to keep moving or find ways to ward it off. The concept was deemed too punishing and the design too similar to Pyramid Head's stalking behavior, so it was abandoned. The patches they couldn't fix, known glitches and exploits. Silent Hill games, like all complex software, contain bugs. Some were fixed in later releases, others persist in every version. A few of the most interesting glitches reveal the underlying systems at work. In the original Silent Hill, there's a rare glitch in old Silent Hill where the game can fail to spawn the keys necessary to enter the school if you trigger certain events out of the expected sequence. This soft locks progression and forces a restart. It's rare enough that most players never encounter it, but speedrunners have documented the exact circumstances that cause it, picking up the 11th Street doghouse key before examining the Matheson Street memo, then immediately entering a specific building. The game's flag system doesn't account for this sequence, resulting in a broken state. The glitch occurs because the game uses a cascading flag system where each event sets conditions for subsequent events. If you skip a flag or trigger them in unexpected order, later flags may not set properly. The keys are tied to specific flags, and if those flags don't trigger, the keys don't spawn. The only way to know you've hit this glitch is when you've exhausted all other options and the required items simply aren't in the world. Silent Hill 2 contains a famous door glitch in the Woodside Apartments. If you perform precise inputs while opening certain doors, James can clip through the geometry and enter out-of-bounds areas. Speedrunners use this to skip entire sections of the apartment segment, emerging on the other side of locked doors, or even exiting the building without triggering required story events. The glitch works because the door opening animation briefly disables collision detection, and careful positioning can exploit the window where James exists in a collisionless state. The door clip was discovered by accident during a casual speedrun stream and has since been refined to a precise science. Speedrunners have mapped which doors are vulnerable to the glitch, the exact positioning required, and the input timing that maximizes success rate. The glitch can save upwards of 15 minutes in a full game speedrun, but requires significant skill to execute consistently. The pause screen in Silent Hill 2 can cause audio desynchronization in specific circumstances. If you pause during certain cutscenes or radio broadcasts and leave the game paused for an extended period, the audio may resume out of sync with the action when you unpause. This is a minor bug but reveals how the game handles audio streams. They're not perfectly locked to the game clock, and long pauses can cause drift. The desync occurs because cutscene audio is streamed from the disc in real time rather than loaded into memory. When you pause, video playback stops, but the audio stream continues buffering in the background. Unpause after a long wait, and the buffered audio has progressed beyond the video, creating misalignment. The game has no mechanism to resync them, so the rest of the cutscene plays with audio ahead of visuals. Silent Hill 3's save system has a known exploit where saving and reloading in specific locations can cause items to respawn. This is particularly useful for ammo and health items in a few key areas. The exploit works because the game's save state doesn't always perfectly track which consumable items have been collected, and reloading can reset those flags. This breaks the resource management balance but isn't game-breaking since the combat isn't difficult enough that unlimited resources trivialize it. The respawn glitch is most notable in the shopping mall, where you can repeatedly save and reload to generate infinite health drinks from the same vending machines. Players discovered this quickly after release, and while it was never patched, it's considered an exploit rather than an intended mechanic. Some challenge runners forbid using the glitch in their rule sets. The Silent Hill 4 apartment has several geometry holes where players can fall out of the level if they move in specific ways. These are mostly in corners of rooms where two wall pieces meet imperfectly. Falling through the world usually results in an endless fall until the game crashes, though sometimes Henry respawns at the apartment entrance as if he'd used the front door. These holes were known during development but deemed low priority since they required players to actively try to break the game. The most notorious hole is in the northeast corner of the bedroom, where aggressive camera manipulation and walking into the corner at specific angles can cause Henry to slip through. Speedrunners briefly experimented with these holes to see if they could be used to skip sections, but the unreliable spawn behavior made them impractical for runs. Origins has a duplication glitch involving certain key items. If you save immediately after picking up specific keys and then reload, the key remains in your inventory but also reappears in the world. This can lead to having multiple copies of unique items, which doesn't break progression but creates odd inventory states. The glitch was fixed in later ports but exists in the original PSP and PlayStation 2 releases. The duplication glitch works because the save system writes inventory state before updating world state, creating a window where the game forgets an item was picked up. Players discovered you could duplicate puzzle items, keys, and even the game's limited ammunition, trivializing resource management if you were willing to save scum repeatedly. Homecoming's combat system has animation canceling exploits that allow skilled players to chain attacks faster than intended. By timing dodges and weapon swaps precisely, you can bypass the recovery frames on melee strikes, effectively stun-locking enemies. This makes combat significantly easier and reveals that the combat system's balance was tuned around players using moves at their intended speed. The animation cancel was discovered when players noticed that certain actions could be interrupted without committing to their full animation. By chaining dodges and attacks with frame-perfect timing, skilled players could essentially break the combat system, creating infinite combos against enemies that weren't designed to handle such pressure. This turned combat from tense resource management into an action game where technique dominated. Downpour has a notorious chase sequence bug in the Devil's Pit mine, where the void that pursues Murphy can sometimes fail to trigger properly, leaving players in a chase scenario with no actual danger. The game expects you to run, but if the void doesn't activate, you can safely walk the entire sequence. This bug is inconsistent and seems related to the game's streaming and loading systems. The void failure appears to be linked to how the game loads assets during the chase. If you enter the chase with certain items equipped, or if you've triggered specific flags earlier, the void entity sometimes fails to spawn properly. Players walking the chase sequence report it feels eerie in a different way. The game is telling you to run through environmental cues and music, but there's nothing actually chasing you. Save corruption has affected multiple games in the series, particularly in the earlier PlayStation releases where memory card management was less robust. Silent Hill 2 and 3 both have documented cases of saves becoming corrupted if the PlayStation 2 is powered off during a save operation. This was common enough that the games display prominent "Do not turn off power" warnings during saves. The corruption issue stems from how the PlayStation 2's memory card system works. Saves are written in blocks, and if power is interrupted mid-write, those blocks can become corrupted or misaligned. Because Silent Hill saves contain significant amounts of data, inventory, flags, map state, puzzle progress, they're particularly vulnerable to corruption if writes are interrupted. The HD collection of Silent Hill 2 and 3 introduced new bugs that weren't in the original releases. These range from audio issues and missing effects to more serious problems, like incorrect enemy behavior and broken puzzle logic. The rushed development and reliance on incomplete source code created a version of the games that's technically newer, but objectively worse in many ways. Fans consider the HD collection the definitive version to avoid, preferring original hardware or enhanced PC ports. The HD collection's problems are well documented and extensive. Missing fog effects that destroy atmosphere, re-recorded voice acting that changes character tone, incorrect sound mixing, broken visual effects, and even changes to puzzle solutions in some areas. The most egregious issues were eventually addressed in patches, but the collection remains inferior to the original releases. The experience serves as a cautionary tale about remastering games without access to original source assets and development documentation. Finally, there are ghosts, visual glitches where enemy models briefly appear in locations where they don't belong, often for a single frame. These occur when the game's culling system fails to properly hide objects that are outside the current playable area. Speedrunners and glitch hunters have documented these thoroughly, creating catalogs of specific locations and camera angles where you can see enemies spawn or despawn if you look carefully. The ghost glitches are particularly common in Silent Hill 2 around loading boundaries. Turn the camera quickly in certain spots, and you can glimpse Pyramid Head standing in a void outside the playable area, waiting to be loaded into his next scene. These glimpses are unintentional but create an unsettling sense that the game's horrors exist just out of sight, ready to manifest when the script calls for them. The strings attached, the files tell secrets. Digging into the game files of Silent Hill titles reveals content that wasn't meant to be seen. Debug text, developer notes, unused strings, and placeholder assets. These discoveries provide windows into the development process. The original Silent Hills disk contains text strings for multiple debug menus that aren't accessible during normal play. These menus allowed developers to warp to any location, spawn any enemy, toggle rendering layers, and adjust game speed. The full range of these tools has been documented by the modding community, who have created patches that re-enable them. Using these tools, players can explore level geometry that's normally hidden, revealing how the seamless-looking town is actually constructed from discrete zones with carefully hidden seams. The debug menus reveal fascinating details about how Team Silent worked. There are options to toggle individual fog layers, adjust monster spawn rates in real time, and teleport between any named location in the game. There's even a frame-by-frame advance option for cutscenes, suggesting the team used this for timing animation and dialogue. The existence of such comprehensive debug tools speaks to how much the team needed to iterate and test given their limited resources. Silent Hill 2's files include unused dialogue for a character that doesn't appear in the game. The character is named Frank, and the lines suggest he was a gas station attendant or shop owner who James would have encountered early in South Vale. The dialogue is fully recorded but never integrated, and there's no visual model associated with the character. It's unclear at what stage Frank was cut or why, but his presence in the files indicates a more populated version of the town in early designs. Frank's dialogue includes lines about seeing strange things in town, questions about whether James is one of them, and warnings to leave before dark. The character seems to have been designed as an early expositional figure who would have hinted at the town's strangeness before James experienced it directly. His removal leaves South Vale feeling more desolate and isolated, which ultimately serves the game's atmosphere better. Some of the most interesting file discoveries are placeholder textures, with developer notes written on them. In Silent Hill 3, certain wall textures in the hospital contain what appear to be in-jokes or test patterns with Japanese text. When translated, these reveal they were meant to be temporary art that would be replaced before shipping, but they made it into the final game in locations where players are unlikely to look closely. One texture includes the text, "This is placeholder. Replace before gold," in Japanese, placed on a wall in an area players would only see if they use debug cameras or photo mode. Another includes what appears to be a developer's doodle of Heather making an annoyed face. These textures were presumably left in because removing them required recompiling level data, and since players would never see them in normal play, they were low priority removals. The games also contain pre-rendered cutscene files at multiple resolutions. In some cases, higher quality versions of these videos exist on the disc but aren't used during normal gameplay. Modders have replaced the default videos with these high-res versions, improving visual quality without changing content. This reveals that the developers created assets that exceeded the platform's capabilities, future-proofing in a sense. Silent Hill 2's disc contains cutscene files at resolutions up to 720p, far exceeding what the PlayStation 2 could display. These high-resolution masters were presumably kept on the disc because removing them wouldn't have saved significant space. Modern modders have extracted these files and replaced the game's default cutscenes with the higher quality versions, creating a significantly improved visual experience on emulators and PC ports. Audio files sometimes include alternate takes of dialogue lines and music tracks. Silent Hill 2's disc contains a longer version of Promise Reprise that includes additional verses not heard in any version of the game. There are also alternate endings for some tracks, different mixing approaches, and isolated stem tracks that let players hear individual instruments. These were likely used during development for editing and testing, but weren't cleaned out before mastering the disc. The extended Promise Reprise includes a fourth verse that changes the song's meaning slightly, becoming more explicit about themes of separation and loss. The isolated stem tracks reveal details about Yamaoka's production, how heavily certain elements are processed, the layering of vocal takes, the subtle variations in guitar tone throughout the track. These stems have allowed fans to create their own remixes and analyses of the series' music. Model files reveal additional details about character and enemy designs. The polygon meshes for creatures often include body parts or details that are never visible during gameplay, either because they're covered by texture work or because the camera never shows those angles. For example, the Pyramid Head model in Silent Hill 2 has a fully modeled face under the helmet, even though this is never revealed in the game. Whether this was an early design that was later covered, or simply a modeling approach that built the full figure before adding the helmet, isn't clear. The face under Pyramid Head's helmet is surprisingly detailed, not monstrous or distorted, but blank and generic, almost mannequin-like. This has led to speculation that the face represents the generic, faceless nature of punishment and judgment, but it's equally possible it's simply a modeling artifact that was never intended to be seen. Several games contain leftover assets from earlier projects. Silent Hill 3's files include texture and sound data that belongs to Silent Hill 2, presumably because the team reused some assets and didn't fully scrub the disk. There are also placeholder 3D models with file names that reference other Konami games, suggesting the developers used whatever was convenient for blocking out scenes before final art was completed. Some of the leftover data is substantial, entire texture sets that were replaced but never deleted, sound effects from Silent Hill 2 that went unused in Silent Hill 3, and even a few enemy models that appeared to be early prototypes for creatures that were substantially redesigned. This data bloat wasn't a major concern in the PlayStation 2 era, as disk space was relatively abundant, and cleaning up unused assets was time-consuming. The most extensive file digging has been done on the PC releases, which are less locked down than console versions. Modders have found entire systems that were disabled but not removed. Silent Hill 2 PC has code for additional graphics options that aren't accessible through the menu but can be enabled by editing configuration files. Some of these options improve visual quality significantly, leading to speculation that they were disabled to ensure the game ran on minimum spec PCs. The hidden graphics options include higher resolution textures, improved shadow quality, extended draw distance, and better anti-aliasing. Enabling these options on modern hardware creates a significantly improved visual experience, suggesting they were intended for future-proofing or for development use, and simply never exposed to players through the interface. Language files contain translations that were completed but never used. Silent Hill 3 has full Italian and Spanish subtitle files that don't appear in any official release. These translations exist, are complete, and are technically functional, but they were never enabled. This suggests the game was planned for release in more territories than it ultimately reached, or that these translations were completed for potential future releases that didn't materialize. The unused translations are fully localized, including menu text, item descriptions, and all dialogue. Some fans have enabled these language options through modding, creating unofficial Italian and Spanish releases. The quality of the translations is reportedly high, suggesting professional translators completed the work before the releases were canceled for business reasons. Some file names are surprisingly descriptive, rather than generic tags like Monster 05 or Texture Hospital 03. The files often have names like Nurse Twitchy Attack Right or Wallpaper Decaying Red Floral, giving direct insight into how the developers thought about these elements. These file name choices provide fascinating insights into development pain points. One texture file in Silent Hill 4 is named Temp Wall Texture. This is the 5th revision. Please stop changing requirements. A sound file is labeled Door Creak Final for real this time final. These moments of developer exasperation, preserved in file names, humanize the creation process. The town that never sleeps. The secrets go deeper the longer you look. Every corner of Silent Hill, every building, every street sign, and rusted chain link fence holds decisions made by someone who wanted to create not just a game, but a place. The fog wasn't just hiding technical limitations, it was hiding the town's bones, the architecture of constraint and creativity that makes these games work. What we carry forward from these discoveries isn't that Silent Hill is perfect. It's that Silent Hill is human, built by small teams working too fast with too little, making compromises and mistakes, leaving things in that shouldn't be there, and taking out things that might have been brilliant. The game succeeded not because everything went right, but because enough things went right in interesting enough ways that players didn't mind what went wrong. The monsters were designed from personal fears. The sounds were built from processed, everyday noises. The buildings borrowed from real architecture. The stories changed during localization. The code has bugs that never got fixed. And somehow, through all of that imperfection, something remarkable emerged. A town that feels more real than places that actually exist, because it contains the fingerprints of everyone who built it. These secrets don't diminish Silent Hill, they reveal it, not as a finished vision handed down from above, but as a collaborative act of creation that continued beyond the development team, into the community that found these details, decoded these files, and kept looking for what was hidden. The town exists in the space between what was made and what was discovered, between intention and interpretation, between the game on the disc and the game in memory. And maybe that's the final secret, that Silent Hill was never meant to be fully understood or completely known. It was meant to be explored, investigated, and puzzled over. It was meant to keep secrets, to reward curiosity, to maintain mystery even after decades of scrutiny. The town doesn't give up everything it knows because it knows that the searching matters as much as the finding. The fog is still there. The radio still crackles. The buildings still stand with their impossible geometries and their too long hallways. And somewhere in the code, in the unused files and debug strings, in the cut content and developer notes, the town continues to exist in all its possible forms. The game that was made, the game that could have been, and the game that lives in the space between them. Sleep well. The town will still be there in the morning, waiting with new secrets for anyone who looks carefully enough.